You think she's not interested. She doesn't flirt hard. She doesn't chase. She keeps it calm, controlled, almost unreadable. So you assume there's nothing there. But what if the very thing you're calling disinterest is actually the most overlooked sign of emotional fixation? Because here's the truth most men never get told in time. Some of the strongest attraction doesn't look like attraction at all. It looks like distance. It looks like silence. It looks like her acting completely unaffected while her mind is doing the exact opposite behind the scenes. And if you've ever felt confused by a woman who seemed cold but never fully disappeared from your orbit, this is going to feel uncomfortably familiar. And I want you to sit with this for a second, because this is where most misunderstandings begin. Men are taught to read attraction like a straight line. If she likes you, she shows it. If she doesn't, she leaves. But real human psychology, especially emotional attraction, doesn't move in straight lines. It moves in tension, in hesitation, in internal conflict. And that changes everything about how you interpret her behavior. Now be honest with yourself for a moment. How many times have you walked away from someone, not because there was no connection, but because you didn't see enough proof of it? How many times did you assume silence meant rejection, when in reality, silence was just her way of trying not to reveal too much too soon? Because here's where this gets uncomfortable. The mind doesn't always express attraction as closeness. Sometimes it expresses attraction as self-control, as hesitation, as emotional restraint, especially when vulnerability feels risky. And this is exactly where we start to misunderstand each other. Sarah, host of What She Thinks YouTube channel. Let's slow this down for a moment, because what you're about to understand will completely reshape how you interpret mixed signals. When a woman feels strong attraction, but doesn't feel emotionally safe expressing it openly, her behavior often splits into two layers. The visible layer looks calm, neutral, even indifferent. But the internal layer is active, curious, and far more emotionally engaged than she would ever admit. And this is where most men miss the entire story, because they only respond to what is visible. They don't realize that emotional investment can grow in silence, that curiosity can deepen without conversation. That distance can sometimes be a form of emotional regulation, not emotional absence. Think about a real-life scenario. A woman meets someone she feels unexpectedly drawn to. Maybe it's not even logical. Maybe it's subtle. Something about the way he speaks, the way he carries himself, the way he doesn't try too hard. But instead of leaning in immediately, she pulls back slightly. Not because she's uninterested, but because interest itself creates exposure, and exposure creates risk. So she regulates it. She delays replies. She stays composed in person. She avoids over-initiating. Not because nothing is happening, but because too much happening too fast feels unsafe to her nervous system. And meanwhile, something else is happening underneath all of that control. She is thinking about you in moments she doesn't expect, replaying conversations, noticing details she didn't consciously choose to store, feeling curiosity spike at random times during her day. Not because she decided to, but because attraction doesn't ask for permission before it starts building mental presence. And if you've ever been on the receiving end of this, it feels confusing, because the external signals don't match the internal pattern you sense. That's where men start doubting themselves. They start filling in the blanks with the wrong story. She's not interested. She's just polite. I'm imagining things. But what if the truth is that you weren't imagining the connection? You were just misreading the expression of it. Now here's something important to understand. Emotional restraint is not emotional absence. And this distinction is where most interpretations fail. A woman can be highly mentally engaged with you while still presenting complete social neutrality. In fact, the stronger the internal reaction, the more carefully she may manage the external expression of it. Because attraction, especially early attraction, often creates a kind of internal tension, a push and pull between curiosity and caution, between interest and self-protection, between wanting to know more and not wanting to reveal too much of herself too soon. And if you don't understand that tension, you will misread the entire situation. You'll think she's not thinking about you, when in reality, you're taking up more mental space than she's comfortable showing. And this is where things get even more interesting, because once the mind attaches curiosity to a person, it doesn't stay static. It starts looping. It starts revisiting. It starts constructing meaning out of small interactions. A pause in conversation becomes something she replays later. A brief moment of eye contact becomes something she reinterprets in hindsight. A casual comment you made becomes something she remembers unexpectedly days later. Not because she decided it mattered, but because attention follows emotional activation. And emotional activation doesn't always announce itself clearly. This is why you can have two completely different interpretations of the same interaction. You walk away thinking it meant nothing. She walks away thinking about it at random moments throughout the week, and neither of you talks about it. That silence creates confusion, but it also creates distance that feels charged. Now here's where most men make their first critical mistake. They assume that visible enthusiasm is the only proof of interest. So when they don't see it, they withdraw. They pull their energy back. They assume the story is over. But in many cases, that's the exact moment when something is just beginning to form internally on her side. Because curiosity doesn't need permission. It grows in the background, quietly, subconsciously, without announcement. And when it's not interrupted, it can deepen more than you realize. But if you misread it too early and walk away, you never see that progression. And that's why this topic matters more than people realize. Because the real signs of interest aren't always in what she does loudly. Sometimes they're hidden in what she does inconsistently, in what she regulates, in what she holds back. And if you start observing from that lens instead of the surface level one, you begin to notice patterns you completely missed before. Small patterns, subtle patterns. Patterns that don't feel like proof at first, but start to form a different picture when you step back. And that's exactly where we're going next. Because once you understand the internal psychology behind why attraction gets hidden instead of expressed, the behavioral signs start to make a completely different kind of sense. And some of them are far more obvious than you've been led to believe, once you know what you're actually looking at. But before we go deeper into those signals, there's something even more important to understand. Because not every cold response means attraction, and not every quiet behavior hides emotion. Sometimes distance is just distance. And learning the difference is where emotional intelligence actually begins to matter. So the question becomes, how do you tell the difference between emotional restraint and emotional absence? And more importantly, what does her behavior start to look like when there is something real underneath the surface? That's where we continue next. Because once you understand the internal conflict behind attraction, you stop looking for loud signals and start noticing the quieter ones. The ones most people dismiss. The ones that don't announce themselves, but repeat themselves. And this is where everything becomes clearer if you're willing to pay attention instead of assuming. One of the strongest indicators of hidden emotional engagement is repetition, not intensity, not dramatic behavior, repetition. The mind returns to what it finds emotionally relevant, even when the person consciously tries to move on from it. So when a woman is thinking about you more than she shows, it rarely appears as one big obvious action. It shows up in small returns, small inconsistencies that don't fully match indifference. She disappears, then reappears. She pulls back, then checks in. She stays quiet, then suddenly engages again with something simple, almost casual. A meme, a short message. "This reminded me of you" text that seems harmless on the surface. But underneath that simplicity is something more revealing. That moment of re-engagement didn't come from nowhere. It came from a buildup. A mental loop that reached a threshold where staying silent felt harder than reaching out. And this is where psychology becomes very clear. The human brain doesn't release emotional tension cleanly when attachment is forming. It oscillates. It creates approach and avoidance cycles. A push toward connection, followed by a pull toward self-protection. This is not manipulation. It's internal regulation. She feels something. She manages it. She steps back. Then she feels it again. And the cycle repeats. And if you only look at one moment in isolation, you will misunderstand the entire pattern. But if you zoom out, you start to see a rhythm. Now think about your real-life experiences. The people who confused you the most were rarely consistent in a predictable way. They were inconsistent in a patterned way. That's a very different thing. Because randomness has no emotional logic, but patterned inconsistency often does. And when you start recognizing that, you stop reacting emotionally and start observing more accurately. Another powerful indicator is memory tied to emotional relevance. Not just remembering facts, but remembering fragments of conversations that had no practical reason to be stored. Things like something you mentioned once in passing, A preference, a small personal detail, a passing story you forgot you even told. And then she brings it up later, casually, as if it was always part of her awareness. This is not just having a good memory. This is selective retention driven by emotional attention. The mind prioritizes what feels meaningful, even if the person is not consciously aware of why it feels meaningful. And when someone starts storing details about you without trying, it usually means you've occupied more mental space than casual interaction would suggest. But here's where most people misread this entirely. They assume memory equals intention. It doesn't. It equals attention. And attention is what builds familiarity. Familiarity is what builds emotional significance over time. That's why these small moments matter more than big ones. Now let's go deeper. Another subtle but powerful sign is social reflection. This is when her environment starts reacting differently around you. Her friends behave slightly differently. There's awareness in their eyes, small reactions that don't match neutrality. Maybe they mention you indirectly. Maybe they react when your name comes up. Maybe there's a shared understanding between them that you haven't been explicitly told about. And this matters because attraction is rarely isolated. People talk, especially among close social circles. Emotional interest is processed collectively, even if it starts individually. So when you enter that space, even indirectly, you may notice shifts. Not obvious ones, subtle ones. The kind that make you wonder if you're imagining things. You're not. But again, this is not proof of obsession or certainty. It's indication of presence, of you occupying mental or conversational space beyond direct interaction. Now let's address something even more misunderstood. The push-pull cycle. She reaches out, then she withdraws. She engages, then she goes quiet. And instead of seeing this as emotional confusion or randomness, it's important to understand the internal negotiation happening underneath it. Because reaching out creates emotional exposure, and emotional exposure can feel vulnerable when someone is still trying to maintain control over how they are perceived. So after initiating contact, there is often a corrective response, a step back, a rebalancing. Not because interest disappeared, but because emotional equilibrium needs to be restored. This is where many men misinterpret silence after engagement as rejection, when in reality, it can simply be emotional recalibration. And if you chase during that recalibration, you interrupt it. You create pressure where there was none intended, and that can change the dynamic completely. But if you stay grounded, something interesting happens. The pattern often repeats, because the internal pull doesn't disappear just because she stepped back. It resurfaces. And each time it resurfaces, the resistance weakens slightly. Not dramatically, not instantly, but gradually. Now, another sign that carries a lot of weight is behavioral contrast. How she acts with others versus how she acts with you. Not in obvious ways, but subtle ones. A slight shift in tone, a difference in pacing, a small hesitation before responding, a different kind of awareness in her body language. When someone doesn't feel emotionally activated, their behavior is uniform, consistent, predictable across contexts. But when someone does feel something, even if they hide it, inconsistency appears in controlled ways. Not chaos, but micro-adjustments. And those micro-adjustments are often where truth leaks through. Now here's something important. None of these signs individually are definitive. Psychology rarely works in absolutes, but patterns create clarity. One sign means little. Two signs mean curiosity. Multiple overlapping signs over time begin to form a pattern that is difficult to ignore. And that's the real skill here. Not jumping to conclusions from one moment, but learning to observe continuity. Because attraction, when it is hidden, is not loud. It is repetitive, subtle, regulated, and often expressed in indirect ways that require patience to understand. Now let's bring this back to something more grounded. If you've been in a situation where someone felt confusing, where their behavior didn't match your expectations, where you found yourself overthinking what things meant, there is a high chance you were trying to interpret signals that were never meant to be interpreted individually. They only make sense as a system. And once you start seeing the system instead of the isolated behavior, your interpretation changes completely. You stop asking, "What did that mean?" And you start asking, "What pattern is repeating here?" That shift alone removes most of the confusion. Because clarity doesn't come from more information. It comes from better interpretation. And when you apply that lens, you begin to see that emotional behavior is rarely random. It's structured by internal tension, personal history, comfort levels, and fear of vulnerability. So when someone seems distant but still present in small ways, the real question is not whether they care or not. The question is, what internal conflict is shaping how they are allowed to show it? And that brings everything into perspective. Because at the end of the day, understanding attraction is not about decoding manipulation or chasing hidden meanings. It's about recognizing that people don't always express what they feel in a direct line. Sometimes they express it in fragments, in pauses, in inconsistencies, in small returns. And if you can read those patterns without overreacting or overassuming, you stop being confused by behavior that used to feel contradictory. You start seeing it for what it is: human, complex, and often much more emotionally involved than it first appears. And that's where real understanding begins.